In February 1944, test pilot Andrei Kashitkov sat in the cockpit of a P63 King Cobra at Bell Aircraft Corporation's factory in Buffalo, New York, watching American engineers argue about whether his next flight would kill him. The aircraft was serial number 4,269,261, brand new, destined for the Soviet Union, one of 2,400 fighters that would be fed across the Bering Strait to fight in a war America wasn't sure the Soviets could win. Kashitkov was 31 years old, one of the Soviet Union's most experienced test pilots with over 2,000 flight hours. He'd flown everything from obsolete biplanes to captured German fighters. The Soviet government had sent him to America for one reason: to make sure the P-63 wouldn't kill Russian pilots the way its predecessor, the P-39 Cobra, sometimes did. The King Cobra looked almost identical to the Cobra. Mid-mounted engine behind the cockpit, tricycle landing gear, car style doors instead of a sliding canopy, 37 cannon firing through the propeller hub. But the King Cobra was bigger, heavier, more powerful. Bell Aircraft had designed it to fix everything wrong with the P-39. Better high-altitude performance, stronger airframe, more speed, more firepower. The U.S. Army Air Forces had tested it in October 1943 and concluded it was inferior to the P-51 Mustang. So, America ordered 3,303 King Cobras and sent 72% of them to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. Never used them in combat, just built them for someone else to fight with. But Kashitkov had discovered something during his testing that the American engineers either didn't notice or didn't care about. The P-63 had a fatal flaw that was going to kill pilots. The center of gravity was wrong. The King Cobra's engine sat behind the pilot. That put enormous mass at the rear of the core of aircraft. During certain flight conditions, especially during spins, the center of gravity shifted too far back. Once that happened, the aircraft became unrollable. Flat spin, no way out. The nose wouldn't come down no matter what the pilot did. The controls stopped working. The aircraft just rotated flatly, falling toward the ground like a leaf. Pilots called it a death spiral. Kashitkov had proven this during his testing. He'd taken a P-63 up to 12,000 ft, deliberately put it into a spin, and tried every recovery technique he knew. Nothing worked. The aircraft buckled under the stress. The airframe bent. He'd barely gotten it back to the ground. The American engineers examined the aircraft and found structural damage that shouldn't have been possible. They said Kashitkov must have done something wrong. Their calculations showed the P-63 was safe. The spin characteristics were within acceptable parameters. Kashitkov disagreed. He'd flown enough aircraft to know when something was trying to kill him. The P-63 was trying to kill him. Soviet pilots had been dying in P-39 era Cobra spin accidents for over a year. Not combat losses, training accidents, pilots losing control during routine maneuvers and entering unrovable flat spins. The pattern was clear. Experienced pilots, good conditions. Mechanically sound aircraft, fatal spins. Nobody could explain it. The P-39 had a reputation. Soviet pilots called it the flying coffin, not because it was shot down easily. The P-39 was actually quite good in combat at low altitude. Soviet pilots loved the nose-mounted cannon, the rugged construction, the sealed cockpit that kept them warm at degrees C, but they feared the spin characteristics. Every pilot knew someone who died in an unrovable spin. Every flight carried that risk. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and the aircraft would flip into a flat spin and fall. By late 1943, the Soviet Air Force had taken delivery of 4,600 P-39-era Cobras. They were using them extensively on the Eastern Front, despite the 1943 agreement with America that prohibited their use against Germany. The agreement said P-39s and P-63s could only be used in the Far East against Japan, but the Soviet Union was losing the war in the West. They needed every fighter they could get, so they secretly deployed P-39s to units fighting the Luftwaffe. Officially, these units were flying Soviet-built aircraft. Unofficially, they were flying American Lendl fighters. The Germans noticed. Luftwaffe pilots started reporting encounters with unusual aircraft. American-looking fighters with mid-mounted engines and tricycle gear. Some German pilots thought they were facing captured aircraft. Others assumed the Americans had sent fighters to help the Soviets. The truth was simpler. The Soviet Air Force was violating the Lendl Agreement because they were desperate, and they were losing pilots to spins almost as fast as they were losing them to German guns. The problem wasn't that Soviet pilots didn't know how to recover from spins. They knew the standard procedure: opposite rudder, forward stick, reduce power, wait for the nose to drop. That technique worked on every Soviet-built fighter: the Yakov, Yak-3, the Lavochkin La-5, the Mikoyan-Gurovich MiG-3. All of them were tail draggers with conventional center of gravity. Put them in a spin, apply recovery technique, they came out. But the P-39 was different. Mid-engine layout, weight distribution unlike anything Soviet pilots had trained on. The center of gravity was farther back than any Soviet aircraft. That changed everything. When a P-39 entered a spin, the standard recovery technique sometimes made it worse. Forward stick shifted weight forward, but not enough to overcome the rear-mounted engine mass. The aircraft just spun faster. Pilots who tried harder recovery inputs sometimes broke the aircraft structurally. The airframe would buckle, the tail would deform, and the pilot would die anyway. Pilots who tried to bail out discovered the car-style doors wouldn't open against the centrifugal force. They'd be trapped inside, watching the ground rush up, unable to escape. The worst part was the psychological effect. Soviet pilots were trained to be aggressive, attack relentlessly, close to short range, use the superior low-altitude performance of Soviet aircraft, but flying the P-39 made them cautious, hesitant. They couldn't afford to maneuver aggressively because one wrong move meant death. That hesitation cost kills. It cost battles. It cost lives in different ways. In December 1943, Bell Aircraft sent detailed specifications for the P63 King Cobra to Moscow. The Soviet government was excited. The P63 was supposed to fix the P-39's problems. Better engine, better performance, better high-altitude capability, better everything. The Soviets immediately requested to send their own experts to America to test the aircraft before accepting mass deliveries. They weren't going to repeat the P-39 mistakes. They needed to know if the P-63 would kill their pilots before they put it into combat. The Soviet government chose Andrei Kochet and engineer Theodore Supranin. Kochkov was an obvious choice. One of the best test pilots in the Soviet Air Force. Calm under pressure, analytical, not afraid to push in aircraft to its limits. Supranin was an aviation engineer who understood structures, aerodynamics, and flight dynamics. Together, they would evaluate whether the P-63 was safe for Soviet use. They arrived at Bell Aircraft in Buffalo in February 1944. The Americans greeted them politely, but didn't take them seriously. To the American engineers, Kochet and Supranin were just foreigners who didn't understand modern aircraft design. Bell had been building fighters for years. They knew what they were doing. The P-63 had been through extensive testing. It was safe. If the Soviets had problems with the P-39, that was probably because Soviet pilots weren't properly trained. The Americans assigned Kochet a series of test flights, standard evaluation, check the controls, test the engine, verify the specifications, nothing dangerous, nothing that would reveal problems. Kochet flew the first test flights and ran through basic maneuvers. Everything seemed normal. Good speed, good climb rate, responsive controls. But Kochet noticed something. The aircraft felt tail-heavy, not dramatically, just slightly, like there was more weight behind him than the aircraft wanted. Then Kochet requested permission to test spin characteristics. The Americans hesitated. They said spin testing wasn't necessary. The P-63 had already been cleared for production. Its spin characteristics were known and acceptable, but Kochet insisted. He said the Soviet Air Force needed to know how the aircraft behaved in spins. It was non-negotiable. The Americans agreed. But they told Kochet to be careful. Don't push it too hard. The P-63 was expensive. Kochov took the P-63 to 12,000 FT and deliberately entered a spin, left rudder aft stick, reduce power. The aircraft rolled left and the nose dropped into a spin. Standard entry, everything normal. Then Kochet tried to recover. Opposite rudder, forward stick. Wait for the nose to drop. Nothing happened. The aircraft kept spinning. Kochetkov tried harder. Full opposite rudder, full forward stick. The aircraft didn't respond. It just kept rotating flatly, falling. He could feel the airframe flexing under the stress. The structure was bending. He tried everything. Neutral controls, opposite aileron, power changes, nothing worked. At 5,000 FT, Kochev prepared to bail out. He reached for the door handle. Then suddenly the nose dropped. The aircraft came out of the spin on its own. Not because Kochev had done anything, just because it had lost enough altitude for the airflow to change. Kochev flew back to Buffalo. He landed, shut down the engine, and told the Americans the P63 had a serious problem. The engineers inspected the aircraft and found structural buckling in the rear fuselage. The airframe had bent under spin loads. That shouldn't have been possible. The P63 was designed to handle that stress, but the evidence was there. Bent metal deformed structure proved that Kochev nearly killed himself. The Americans didn't believe him at first. They thought Kochev had done something wrong during the spin, used improper technique, exceeded load limits. But Kochev insisted he'd used standard procedures. The problem wasn't his technique. The problem was the aircraft. Engineer Fodor Supran agreed. He examined the P63's design specifications and found the issue. The center of gravity was too far off. When the aircraft was loaded with fuel and ammunition, the weight distribution created an unstable condition during spins. Once the aircraft entered a flat spin, the tail-heavy configuration prevented normal recovery. The only way out was to wait and hope the aircraft self-roved at lower altitude. That wasn't acceptable for combat operations. Soviet pilots couldn't afford to lose 5,000 FT every time they needed to recover from a spin. They'd be dead before they hit the ground. The Bell engineers reviewed Supran's calculations and reluctantly agreed. He was right. The P63 had a center of gravity problem. It was subtle, but it was real. The question was what to do about it. Redesigning the aircraft would delay production for months, maybe years. That would cost millions of dollars and potentially cancel the entire program. The U.S. Army Air Forces had already decided not to use the P63 in combat. If the Soviets rejected it, too, Bell would have 3,000 aircraft nobody wanted. The company would face financial disaster. So, the engineers proposed a compromise. Move the center of gravity forward by relocating equipment and adding ballast. It wouldn't completely eliminate the problem, but it would make the aircraft safer. Pilots would still need to be careful, but the spin characteristics would be less dangerous. Kochev tested the modified P63. The changes helped. The aircraft still felt tail-heavy, but the spin recovery was more predictable. He could get out of a spin using standard techniques without waiting for self-roving. It wasn't perfect, but it was acceptable. Kochev made one final recommendation to Bell aircraft. If a P63 enters a flat spin and recovery is impossible, the pilot should bail out immediately. Don't try to fight the controls. Don't waste time, just get out. The Irving parachute company heard about Kochev's recommendation and sent him a commendation They appreciated any advice that would save pilots' lives. What neither Bell aircraft nor the Soviet Air Force fully realized was how significant Kotchet's testing would prove to be. By identifying the spin problem before mass production ramped up, Kotchev had saved dozens, possibly hundreds of Soviet pilots' lives, but his role didn't stop there. Over the next 6 months, Kotchev and Supran worked closely with Bell engineers to modify the P63 for Soviet use. They recommended increasing pilot armor. The P63 had basic protection, but Soviet pilots were used to heavier armor, flying at low altitude. Against German anti-aircraft fire meant taking hits. More armor meant more survival. Bell added 68 kg of additional armor plate around the cockpit on the P63A5 variant. They recommended adding a fuselage hardpoint for bombs. The original P63 was designed primarily as a fighter, but Soviet doctrine emphasized ground attack, the ability to carry bombs or rockets was essential. Bell added the hardpoint on the A5 variant. They recommended underwing hard points for additional fuel tanks or bombs. Extended range was crucial for Soviet operations. The Eastern Front was vast. Missions could cover hundreds of kilometers. Without drop tanks, the P63 didn't have enough range. Bell added underwing hard points on the A6 variant. They recommended moving the 37 cannon forward in the nose. The original position created nose-heavy characteristics during firing. Moving it forward improved the center of gravity and allowed more ammunition. 30 rounds wasn't enough for sustained combat. Bell moved the cannon forward and increased ammunition capacity to 58 rounds on the A9 variant. Every one of these changes came directly from Soviet input. Bell aircraft implemented them because the Soviet Union was their primary customer. 72% of all P63s would go to the Soviet Air Force. If the Soviets wanted modifications, Bell made modifications. By mid-1944, the P63 had become a joint American-Soviet design, conceived in America, refined by Soviet requirements, built for Soviet pilots. The first P63 King Cobras arrived in the Soviet Union in summer 1944. The delivery route was one of the most dangerous ferry operations of the war. Aircraft were flown from Buffalo to Great Falls, Montana. This leg covered over 1,500 m across the United States. Weather was generally good. Navigation was straightforward. From Great Falls, ferry pilots flew north through Canada, following the northwest staging route. This was a chain of airfields built specifically for ferrying aircraft to Alaska. Each leg averaged 200 to 300 m. Edmonton, Fort Nelson, Watson Lake, White Horse, each airfield H. Add fuel, basic maintenance, and shelter, but weather conditions deteriorated as pilots flew north. Temperatures could drop to -30 degrees C, even in summer. Clouds obscured mountains. Visibility could drop to 0 in minutes. Many pilots had never flown in these conditions. The accident rate was significant. Aircraft hit mountains in clouds, pilots got lost and ran out of fuel. Engines failed in extreme cold. Some pilots simply disappeared. Their aircraft were never found. From White Horse, pilots flew to Fairbanks, Alaska. This was often the most dangerous leg. The route crossed some of the most remote terrain in North America: mountain ranges, glaciers, wilderness, where survival was impossible if you went down. At Fairbanks, American ferry pilots turned the aircraft over to Soviet crews. Soviet pilots, many of them combat veterans pulled from frontline units, took over for the final dangerous leg from Fairbanks to Nome, then across the Bering Strait to Siberia. The Bering Strait crossing was only 55 mi, but it was terrifying. No radio navigation aids, no emergency landing sites. If your engine quit, you went into water so cold you'd be dead in minutes. Pilots flew in groups when possible, watching each other. If someone went down, the others could mark the position and hope a rescue boat could get there. Once across the strait, pilots faced another 1,000 miles across Siberia to reach Soviet bases. The route went through Anadyr, Samchin, and Yakutsk. Each leg was flown in marginal conditions: primitive airfields, minimal maintenance, extreme weather. Many aircraft were damaged or destroyed during this phase, but most made it through. The pilots who flew these missions were incredibly skilled and incredibly brave. They received almost no recognition at the time and very little since. By September 1944, the Soviet Air Force had received over 400 P63 King Cobras. They didn't deploy them immediately. Soviet commanders wanted their pilots to train on the new aircraft before putting them into combat. The P63 was more powerful than anything Soviet pilots had flown, faster, more complex. It required careful training. Training units were established in the Soviet Far East, nominally preparing for eventual operations against Japan. But everyone knew some of these aircraft would end up fighting the Luftwaffe in the West. The 1943 agreement with America said P-63s could only be used against Japan, but the Soviet Union was fighting for survival. They'd use whatever weapons they had wherever they needed them. Soviet test pilots evaluated the P-63 against captured German fighters. They flew mock combat against Messid Bf-109G4s and Fowler-Wolf 190A4s. The results were interesting. At high altitude above 5,000 m, the German fighters had an advantage: better climb rate, better speed. The P-63 couldn't match them up there, but at low altitude below 3,000 m, the P-63 dominated. Superior horizontal maneuverability, better roll rate. The P-63 could outturn both German fighters in sustained turns. The roll rate was particularly impressive: 110 degrees S at 275 mph. That was faster than the P Thunderbolt, faster than the P-51 Mustang, faster than anything the Japanese Navy flew. For dog fighting at low altitude, the P63 was exceptional. Soviet pilots developed tactics specifically for the P63. Never fight above 5,000 m, keep it low. Where the P63's strengths work best, use the superior roll rate to reverse. Direction quickly. The German fighters couldn't follow. Use the 37 cannon. Sparingly, low rate of fire. Save it for close-range shots. Use the 50 caliber. Machine guns for suppressive fire and leading targets. Use the armor protection to survive hits and keep. Fighting. The P63 could take damage that would destroy a Soviet-built fighter. Trust the airplane. It was built to take punishment, stay aggressive, close to. Short range. Don't give German pilots time to gain altitude where they have the advantage. By December 1944, multiple Soviet units were reportedly operating P63 King Cobras on the Eastern Front. Official records showed they were flying P-39 Araco Cobras or Soviet-built fighters, but German pilots were reporting encounters with aircraft that didn't match known Soviet types, larger than P-39s, faster, more maneuverable at low altitude. The Germans assumed they were facing a new Soviet design. They were partly right. The P-63 was new, but it wasn't Soviet. It was American, built in Buffalo, modified by Soviet test pilots, flown by Soviet pilots who weren't supposed to have them. One of the units that reportedly converted to P-63s was the 4th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. This was an elite unit commanded by some of the Soviet Union's top aces. Officially, they flew P-39-era Cobras, according to veteran accounts. Published decades later, they transitioned to P-63 King Cobras in late 1944. A pilot who served in the 4th Guards later wrote in his memoirs that the entire regiment converted to P-63s. He claimed they flew the King Cobra combat over East Prussia, Poland, and during the final assault on Berlin in April and May 1945. German sources support this. Luftwaffe pilot Hans-Ulrich Rudel, Germany's most decorated combat pilot, wrote in his memoirs about encountering American-type aircraft over the Courland Pocket in early 1945. He specifically mentioned era Cobras, King Cobras, and Boston. He described them as fast, maneuverable, and dangerous at low altitude. Rudel noted that these American aircraft were flown differently than Soviet fighters, more aggressive, more willing to close to short range. The tactics were distinctly Soviet, but the aircraft were American. German flak batteries also reported shooting down aircraft that appeared to be P-63 King Cobras. Reports described mid-engine fighters with tricycle landing gear, larger than P-39s. Some were recovered and examined. They had American markings, American serial numbers, American equipment, but they were being flown by Soviet pilots in Soviet-controlled airspace. The Germans couldn't figure it out. Were the Americans secretly fighting alongside the Soviets? Had captured aircraft been put back into service, or were the Soviets violating some agreement nobody had told the Germans about? The truth never reached German intelligence. The Soviet Union maintained complete secrecy. Official records showed only P-39s in service on the Eastern Front. The P-63s didn't exist in paperwork. They were ghosts, American-built phantoms, flown by Soviet pilots who weren't supposed to have them. Years later, after the war, Soviet historians would deny that P-63s fought in Europe. Official records supported the denial. No documentation, no mission reports, no confirmation. But pilots remembered. German pilots remembered. The evidence was buried in memoirs and anecdotal accounts that nobody could officially verify. What is verified beyond doubt is that P63 King Cobras fought against Japan in August 1945. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, the Red Army launched a massive offensive into Manchuria and northern Korea. Soviet air power supported the invasion. Among the fighters deployed were P-63 King Cobras from the 190th Fighter Aviation Division and the 245th Fighter Aviation Division. These units flew from bases in the Soviet Far East and attacked Japanese positions across Manchuria. On August 15, 1945, Lieutenant Ifmiri Nishenko from the 17th Fighter Aviation Regiment shot down a Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa fighter off the coast of North Korea. This was the first confirmed air-to-air victory for a P-63 King Cobra. The engagement occurred at low altitude over the Sea of Japan. Mirage Nishenko's flight of 4 P-63s intercepted a formation of Japanese fighters escorting bombers. The Soviet pilots dove from altitude, built up speed, and engaged. Mirage Nishenko got behind a Ki-43 and fired a burst from his 37 cannon and 50 caliber machine guns. The Japanese fighter exploded. Mirage Nishenko pulled up, reversed, and engaged another target. His wingman called out 2 more Japanese fighters diving from above. Mirage Nishenko rolled hard left using the P-63's superior roll rate and came nose with the diving Japanese fighter. Both pilots fired. The Japanese fighter rounds hit Mirage Nishenko's left wing. Mirage Nishenko's rounds hit the Japanese fighter engine. The Japanese aircraft streamed smoke and turned away. Mirage Nishenko didn't pursue. He was low on fuel and ammunition. He reformed with his flight and returned to base. 1 confirmed kill, 1 probable, no losses. Over the next week, Soviet P-63 units flew hundreds of sorties against Japanese targets. They conducted escort missions. For bombers, they flew close air support for ground forces. They attacked Japanese airfields and supply lines. P-63 proved well suited for these missions. Its low-altitude performance was perfect for ground attack. The 37 cannon was devastating against soft targets, trucks, trains, buildings, aircraft on the ground. The 50 caliber machine guns provided suppressive fire. The armor protection allowed pilots to fly through light anti-aircraft fire and survive. Japanese pilots quickly learned to avoid P-63s at low altitude. The King Cobra was too maneuverable, too well-armed. Japanese fighters tried to engage from above using altitude advantage, but Soviet pilots refused to climb. They stayed low where the P-63 dominated. By August 23, 1945, when the Soviet offensive ended, P-63 units had destroyed dozens of Japanese aircraft on the ground and in the air. Exact numbers are difficult to verify. Soviet records are incomplete, but the impact was clear. The P-63 had proven itself in combat, not in American hands, in Soviet hands. Fighting a war America wasn't officially part of, using tactics America hadn't developed, succeeding in a role America hadn't envisioned. After the war ended, the Soviet Air Force continued operating P-63 King Cobras until approximately 1950. By then, they had over 100 King Cobras in service. The aircraft was used for training pilots transitioning to jet fighters. The P-63 had tricycle landing gear, similar to the new MiG-15 jet. Soviet-built piston-engine fighters all had tail landing gear. The transition from tail dragger to tricycle gear was difficult. The P-63 provided an intermediate training platform. Pilots could learn tricycle gear procedures on the King Cobra before moving to jets. This reduced accidents and saved lives during the transition to jet aviation. Some Soviet units converted P-63s into two-seat trainers. They removed the weapons bay and installed a second cockpit where the 37 cannon had been. These modified aircraft were called 63 UTI trainers. They were actually safer than regular P-63s because the center of gravity shifted forward with the second cockpit. That reduced the spin tendency Captivate had identified years earlier. The Soviets also experimented with other modifications, ski landing gear for winter operations that never entered production but was tested extensively, rocket rails for air-to-ground rockets. This became standard on many Soviet P-63s, wing-mounted fuel tanks for extended range. Soviet engineers modified captured German drop tank designs to fit the P-63's underwing hard points. By 1950, when the P-63 was finally retired from Soviet service, it had been given the NATO reporting name Fred. Western intelligence had been tracking Soviet King Cobra operations for years. They knew the Soviets had them. They knew the Soviets were using them extensively, but they didn't know the full story. They didn't know about Captivate's testing. They didn't know about the secret deployment to Europe. They didn't know how much Soviet input had shaped the aircraft's development. The P-63's story in American service was completely different. The U.S. Army Air Forces never used the P-63 in combat. Not once, not in Europe, not in the Pacific, not anywhere. The decision had been made in October 1943. The P-63 was inferior to the P-51 Mustang. That was the official conclusion. The Mustang was faster at high altitude. It had longer range. It was already in production. The P63 offered nothing the Mustang couldn't do better. So, America built P63 King Cobras and sent them to someone else. But the U.S. military found another use for them: Operation Pinball. This was one of the most unusual programs in American aviation history. The Army Air Forces needed to train bomber gunners, men who sat in the tail, waist, or top turret of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-25 Mitchells. These gunners needed to learn how to hit fast-moving fighters with .50 caliber machine guns. Training on ground ranges wasn't realistic. Shooting at moving targets in the air was completely different, so the military developed a solution: turn P-63 King Cobras into manned flying targets. The concept was simple but dangerous. Take a P-63, remove all weapons and unnecessary equipment, cover the entire aircraft with over 2,164 lb of special duralumin alloy armor plate, install sensors under the armor that detect bullet impacts, connect the sensors to a bright light mounted in the propeller hub. The light flashes when the aircraft is hit. Paint the entire aircraft bright orange so it's visible from long range. Now put a pilot inside and fly it while trainee gunners shoot at it with special frangible bullets. Frangible bullets were made of compressed lead dust and plastic. They would hit the armor and disintegrate into powder. No penetration, no damage. Just a puff of dust and a flashing light. In theory, this was perfectly safe. The armor was thick enough to stop .50 caliber rounds. The frangible bullets were designed to break apart on impact. The pilot was completely protected, in theory and practice, sitting in a P-63. While multiple machine gunners shot at you was terrifying. Pilots who flew these missions said the sound of bullets hitting the armor was like being inside a steel drum during a hailstorm. Constant metallic impacts. Bang, bang, bang. The airplane shuddered from the hits. The flashing light in the propeller hub was so bright it was disorienting. And occasionally, a non-frangible bullet would get mixed into the ammunition. A real bullet, steel core, armor-piercing, those could penetrate. Pilots who flew Operation Pinball missions were volunteers, experienced pilots who understood the risks. They wore the heaviest flight gear available, double-thick flight suits, extra armor plates strapped to their bodies. The cockpit had bulletproof glass windows. A steel grille covered the air intake. Steel guards protected the exhaust stacks. The P-63 was essentially a flying tank, slow, heavy but incredibly tough, and the pilots who flew them earned respect. Flying a manned target while people shot at you required nerves most pilots didn't have. The program ran from late 1943 until the end of the war. Thousands of bomber gunners trained on Operation Pinball targets. Training missions followed a specific pattern. The P-63 would fly at various altitudes and speeds, simulating enemy fighter attacks. Gunners would track the bright orange aircraft and fire when it came within range. The sensors registered every hit. Instructors could evaluate gunner performance based on how many times the light flashed. Some training missions involved multiple RP-63s attacking from different angles. This simulated coordinated enemy fighter attacks. Gunners learned to prioritize targets, manage ammunition, and coordinate with other gunners. The realism was unprecedented. Nothing in previous training had prepared gunners for shooting at an actual moving aircraft. The psychological factor was significant too. Knowing a real pilot was inside that orange target made trainees more careful about their shooting. They learned trigger discipline. They learned not to waste ammunition. They learned to wait for good shots instead of spraying bullets. Wildly, the program was considered highly successful. Gunner accuracy improved dramatically. Before operation pinball, the average bomber-gunner hit rate was less than 2%. After training on RP-63s, hit rates climbed to over 8%. That four-fold improvement translated to better bomber survival rates in combat. More German and Japanese fighters were shot down by defensive gunners. More bombers made it home. The RP-63 pilots who made this possible were doing one of the most dangerous jobs in military aviation. Every flight meant hundreds of bullets striking their aircraft. Every mission carried the risk that a non-frangible bullet would penetrate and kill them, but they kept flying because they knew the training saved lives. Every gunner they trained was one more man who might survive combat. Every bomber that made it home was one more crew saved. The P63s used in Operation Pinball were redesignated RP-63A and RP-63C. The R stood for restricted. These aircraft couldn't be used for normal flight operations. They were too heavy, too modified. They existed solely as flying targets. After the war ended, many of these aircraft were scrapped. Some were converted back to regular P-63s. A few survived and ended up in museums or private collections. The P63 King Cobra was never officially credited to any individual designer, the way some aircraft are associated with specific engineers. It was a corporate product developed by Bell Aircraft Corporation, refined by Soviet test pilots, modified for Soviet requirements, built for export. But if there's one person who deserves recognition for making the P-63 safe and effective, it's Andrei Kotchek. Kotchek returned to the Soviet Union in late 1944. He continued working as a test pilot throughout the rest of the war and into the 1950s. He tested Soviet jet fighters. He evaluated captured German aircraft. He trained younger test pilots. He never received public recognition for his work on the P-63. Soviet policy during the Cold War was to downplay Lend-Lease contributions. Official histories emphasized Soviet-built aircraft. Americans supplied fighters like the P-39 and P-63 were mentioned briefly, if at all. Kotchek's role in identifying the spin problem and improving the design was classified. The modifications he recommended were attributed to Soviet engineers working independently. His name didn't appear in any official documents, but pilots who flew the P63 knew. They knew that someone had made the aircraft safer. Someone had fixed the problems that killed pilots in the P-39. Someone had made sure the P-63 wouldn't kill them the same way. They didn't know Kochet's name, but they knew someone had saved their lives. Fodor Suprun, the engineer who worked alongside Captivate, also returned to the Soviet Union and continued his career in aviation engineering. He worked on Soviet fighter development programs through the 1950s and 60s. His contributions to the P-63 were similarly classified and unrecognized. Engineer Suprun understood aerodynamics better than most of the American engineers at Bell Aircraft. His calculations about the center of gravity problem were correct. His recommendations for modifications were practical and effective, but his name never appeared in Bell Aircraft documents or American aviation history. The pilots who flew P63 King Cobras in combat have mostly been forgotten. Lieutenant Myros Nishenko, who scored the first confirmed King Cobra kill against Japan, survived the war. He continued flying fighters in the Soviet Air Force. Through the late 1940s, his name appears in a few Soviet military records. No medals, no public recognition, just a footnote in combat reports. The pilots of the 4th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment who reportedly flew P-63s over Berlin are unknown. Their names don't appear in any records. If they existed, if they really did convert to King Cobras in 1944, their story died with them. The official Soviet records say it never happened. Western historians treat it as unconfirmed. German sources mention it, but can't prove it. The truth is probably somewhere here in between. Some P-63s probably fought in Europe. Maybe not the entire 4th Guards Regiment. Maybe just a few aircraft, a handful of pilots, flying missions that didn't officially exist, achieving victories that were attributed to other aircraft types. The Soviet Union maintained this deception for decades. Even after the Cold War ended and archives opened, documentation remained incomplete. The story of the P-63 in Soviet service is full of gaps that will never be filled. Bell Aircraft Corporation built 333 P-63 King Cobras between October 1943 and December 1945. Of those, at least 2,397 went to the Soviet Union. Some sources say as many as 2,672. The exact number is unclear because some aircraft were lost in transit and never officially delivered. 114 P-63s went to the Free French Air Force in 1945. They arrived too late for World War II combat, but saw action in the First Indochina War in the late 1940s. French pilots used them for ground attack and close air support against Vietnam forces. The P-63s were eventually replaced by Grumman F-8F Bearcats. A handful of P63s remained in American service for testing and evaluation. NASA used several for high-speed flight. Research racing enthusiasts modified P63s for unlimited air racing. These aircraft had clipped wings, modified engines, and custom paint schemes. Some were quite successful, others crashed. One notable racing P63 called Tipsy Miss was flown by John Sandberg. The aircraft was painted bright orange, white, and black. It competed in unlimited races through the 1980s, eventually sold to a European pilot, destroyed in a fatal accident in 1990. Another racing King Cobra called Crazy Horse Campgrounds was the most radically modified P63 ever built. Larry Haven's aircraft had clipped wings, a tiny bubble canopy, and a polished aluminum finish. It appeared as Race 90. The aircraft crashed into the ocean during a test flight in 1972. The pilot died. Today, fewer than 20 P63 King Cobras remain in existence. Most are in museums. A few are airworthy and appear at air shows. One particularly tragic loss occurred on November 12, 2022 at the Wings Over Dallas Air Show in Texas. A P63 King Cobra, civil registration N6763, owned by the Commemorative Air Force and piloted by Craig Hutane, collided with a Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress during a demonstration flight. The collision killed Hutane and 5 people aboard the B-7. The accident shocked the warbird community and resulted in increased safety protocols at air shows. The question in the title was whether the P63 King Cobra was the best American World War II dog fighter. The answer is complicated. In American service, it was never used in combat, so there's no data. The U.S. Army Air Forces chose the P-51 Mustang instead. That choice made sense for American requirements. The Mustang had longer range, better high-altitude performance, simpler logistics. For escorting bombers deep into Germany, the Mustang was superior. But the question changes if you consider Soviet use. In Soviet hands, the P-63 proved highly effective at low altitude. Superior roll rate, good maneuverability, heavy firepower, rugged construction. For the type of combat the Soviets fought, low-altitude dog fights and ground attack, the P-63 was excellent. Was it the best? That depends on how you define best. Best at what mission? Best under what conditions? Best compared to what alternatives? At high altitude above 20,000 ft, the P-63 couldn't match the P-51 Mustang or the P-47 Thunderbolt. It didn't have the engine performance for long-range escort missions. The P-63 had insufficient fuel capacity, even with drop tanks. For bomber interception, the 37 cannon had too low a rate of fire. But at low altitude below 10,000 ft, the P-63 was exceptional. It could outturn most German fighters. It could outroll everything the Japanese flew. It could survive damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. For the missions the Soviets flew, the P63 was one of the best fighters available. Not perfect, the spin characteristics were dangerous. Even after Kochav's modifications, the center of gravity was still too far off. Pilots had to be careful, but with proper training and tactics, the P63 was a highly effective combat aircraft. The King Cobra's armor and rugged construction saved lives. Pilots who took hits and survived credited the aircraft's toughness. The proof is also in the longevity. The Soviet Air Force kept P-63s in service until 1950, 5 years after the war ended. They didn't retire aircraft that didn't work. They kept the P-63 because it was useful. Training pilots for jets, maintaining combat readiness, supporting operations. In the Far East, the P-63 served Soviet needs better than many Soviet-designed aircraft. That's how aviation history actually works. Not through dramatic flying aces or decisive battles, but through test pilots and engineers who identify problems and fix them before those problems kill people. Andrei Kashetkov didn't shoot down Enem. Why aircraft? He didn't win any spectacular victories. He didn't get any medals or public recognition. He just flew a P63 King Cobra to its limits, identified a fatal design flaw, and made sure it was fixed before the aircraft killed Soviet pilots. That probably saved more lives than any fighter ace ever did. Innovation in wartime doesn't come from official programs or government committees. It comes from people like Kochet who see problems nobody else notices and have the courage to demand changes even when everyone says they're wrong. Bell Aircraft's engineers said the P-63 was safe. Their calculations proved it, their testing showed it. But Kochet flew the aircraft and knew better. He trusted his hands and his experience more than their numbers, and he was right. The story of the P-63 King Cobra is a story about collaboration across cultures and political systems. American engineering, Soviet testing, joint modifications, shared lessons, all happening during a war when America and the Soviet Union were allies by necessity, not by choice. The P-63 represents what's possible when countries work together to solve problems. Not perfectly, not without friction, but effectively. The result was an aircraft that served Soviet pilots better than anything they could have built themselves at that time. And it happened because a test pilot named Andrei Kochetov refused to accept an aircraft that would kill the people flying it. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us what you think about the P-63 King Cobra. Was it the best American dog fighter? Or does that title belong to the Mustang or Thunderbolt? Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.